Hey folks, David Stewart here. I have been asked by a couple of people to do a video on dialogue or how to write good dialogue, so I'd like to do that, except I'm going to do sort of an inversion of that. I am going to talk about what to avoid when you don't want to write bad dialogue. Why? Well, it's a little easier to talk about what not to do than to talk about what to do in pretty much any circumstance. It's easy to tell somebody stealing is wrong versus telling them every positive action they can make in the world. So here's some stuff that you can avoid if you're writing dialogue, and generally if you can avoid all the bad stuff, you're probably going to be left with at least decent dialogue, which is going to be good enough to serve your purposes in most cases. The first thing that you should probably avoid with dialogue is what I call expositional dialogue. I've used worse terms for this in the past, like functional dialogue. Functional dialogue makes it sound good, but what essentially you're doing with expositional dialogue is you are spelling things out for the audience that shouldn't have to be spelled out through dialogue. A great example would be at the beginning of episode 1, there's Queen Amidala sitting around with all her ministers and whatnot, and they're basically saying stuff that they all already know about the Trade Federation and how Naboo is and how the Senate is and this kind of stuff. They're saying the Senate is full of corrupt people, right? Like, this is information for the audience rather than for the characters themselves. So characters are not going to say that kind of stuff to each other. It's exposition. You might also see this is a really, really good example that's very short but very easy to recognize. In episode 7, same franchise Star Wars, you have a bunch of X-Wings attacking the Starkiller base, and while they're attacking Poe Dameron is telling the other pilots, he's like, when the sun goes out, this thing's going to fire and it's going to all be over. And he's essentially doing exposition. He's setting up the success and failure conditions for that particular part of the plot. We got to blow up the Starkiller base. The thing is, the audience already knew that, or the audience could have figured it out by watching the movie because it was visually well represented, and it's unlikely that he would be explaining those conditions while they're engaged in the attack, because they would probably already know what they were doing there, and they probably took them a while to get to Starkiller Base, just as an example. Now, the thing is, it's kind of hard to avoid all expositional dialogue. You're probably going to have some. It's just you don't want it to be too obvious or too awkward, and if you do have it, you want to contain it in a way that it makes sense for those characters to be having that expositional dialogue. And this is really, really important for comics and for movies, those visual mediums. When you're dealing with a book, when you're writing narration, it's a little bit easier to avoid because you can just have that exposition in the narrative. You can have it in prose and avoid this entire conundrum. But same setup in Star Wars, Episode 4, the original Star Wars 1977. You have the same scene, essentially. You have an attack on a giant spherical base that's going to blow up planets. So the attack on the Death Star is happening, and they give that same information. They give a success condition and a failure condition for the plot. Blow up the Death Star. The success condition, you got to shoot these torpedoes into this little 2-meter hole. The failure condition, you don't do that, right? And they do it through a military briefing because this is a scene in which it would make sense for the characters to be telling each other this information. You have a general, he's explaining the attack plan, what they have to do to blow up the Death Star, how they figured this out. Like, all this stuff is essentially exposition, and it's done through dialogue. However, you contain it in such a way that most people are not going to hear that dialogue and be like, why would he just explain that? That's just exposition and dialogue. It's framed in such a way that it's not objectionable in any way. So you have to be able to recognize those things. So if you have a couple of characters and you want them to talk and give some exposition for another character, you can have them meet someone new, and that new person's like, who's that person over there? Like, if you have a new kid at a school, if you're writing like a high school drama or something, who's that kid? Oh, that kid's this, and he's this way. Gives you a little bit of exposition on that character, so you can frame it in such a way that you can avoid that. Another thing that you probably ought to avoid is talking about your feelings too directly. Now, most normally well-adjusted people are able to talk about their feelings directly, especially with somebody that they know really well. However, that's not the case with most people you meet, and that's not the way that most people react when they're feeling strong emotions. They don't say, I'm angry. It's not, I'm reminded of this scene from Futurama where, like, the robot devil comes out in the opera and says, you just can't have your characters just saying how they feel. That makes me angry. So you probably don't want to have characters say, I'm angry. You have to think about what they do when they're angry and the things that you say when you're angry. When you're actually angry at someone, you don't go, I'm angry with you. You you insult them. You say, "You're a jerk," right? So that's the way that you would correct that dialogue to avoid just saying, "Here's how I feel." And if you're kind of experienced, you're like, well, I probably never do that. You'd be surprised how often or how easy it is to kind of fall into the talking about feelings trap. However, that doesn't mean you never avoid them, right? If you have characters and they have an intimate relationship and they can actually talk about how they feel about each other, then it's totally appropriate. It's not something you have to avoid in all circumstances. But you kind of want to think about how they feel and what things you would say if you felt like angry or scared or something like that. What would you do? What would you really say? You probably wouldn't just say, "I feel this way." Which brings me to a third thing to avoid, which is over-characterization. This is the novice writer's big trap because you're really focused on characters. Characters are what drives the story. So you tend to write, in some cases, a lot of superfluous scenes with characters where characters are really doing whatever their character is. And you imagine these characters as having these really particular kind of, these really particular flaws, these really particular strengths, these really particular mannerisms in a lot of cases. And every time you do that, you're just really hammering those mannerisms. When I go back and I read the first book I ever wrote, this is definitely what I did. And it's a big thing that I've grown on as an artist over the years, is figuring out how to properly write characters so that they're characterized well. We know who they are, but they're not melodramatically characterized. And just as an example, let's imagine you had like a tough guy character. He wouldn't be doing the Joe Pesci Goodfellas scene in every single scene. Like, "You think I'm a clown?" He wouldn't be getting angry all the time. That might happen in a limited circumstance, or there might be something very meaningful to provoke that, but he probably wouldn't just be emoting like that at all times of the day. It just wouldn't really be a realistic character if you were doing that, and that's not really what the character does in Goodfellas. We get this idea that he's kind of edgy, but it's only in that one scene where you get to kind of see that there's something really wrong there. So it's good to have a couple scenes like that if you have a tough guy or one or two, but you don't want to hammer it home in every single scene. A good example would be, say, like Spider-Man. Spider-Man always has these sort of one-line jokes that he does, and they're usually pretty cheesy. That's kind of part of the way that they've written Spider-Man for years and years. It would be Spider-Man without those, but at the same time, it's not one on every single page for every single thing he does, where it's like Spider-Man makes one-liners, and he makes a one-liner for every action he does. He'll do like one, maybe two in an issue, and that's what you're going to get from him, and that's part of his character, but it's not like such a present part of him. You kind of want to think about how you are as a person. If you're somebody that's really into heavy metal, I don't really talk about heavy metal that much unless I'm with somebody else who really cares about heavy metal, and even then we'll probably talk briefly and then move on to other subjects. So if you have a guy who's constantly talking about heavy metal, that person is going to end up coming off as something socially wrong with them when you actually look at that character, like they're autistic or something. They have some other sort of disorder that's making them fixate on one little thing like heavy metal. So you have to be careful with over characterization, or characters come off very unrealistic or awkward or very off-putting. You want to think about who they are on a deep level and what in the plot is going to provoke that characterization. The best way that you are going to characterize is through the actions of the plot, through the means of the plot. Something happens and that provokes something interesting or unique about your character, rather than the character is just with another character and they happen to be being characters with each other. That tends to not come off very well, and you can actually bore a reader if they're not that interested in the characters. And in fact, I could think of lots of probably really good-selling books, best-selling books, like several of the Wheel of Time books, where a huge portion of the book is spent with characters just interacting with each other and talking, and there's no forward momentum on the plot, and it becomes very boring because those characters by themselves can't carry that interest, and you want to see them having those reactions, but to something meaningful that's happening in the story. So if you have somebody that has a short temper, some plot event happens that sets them off and they explode and get angry at someone. That's what you want to happen. You don't want to have a scene where it's just like, let's have his son knock over his Lego castle and the guy just yells at him. That's not a plot event. It'd be better if it's like the son does something specific that reveals something important for the plot. That the son knocks the phone off the table, and the father yells at him, but then he picks up the phone and it's something meaningful, or he knocks the phone off the table and exposes that his father's been cheating, and the father has this explosion and starts breaking things, and then you're seeing something meaningful affect that. That's probably the best way to do characterization. That's pretty efficient. That's just advice. You don't have to do that. And of course, it's okay to have some scenes of just characterization along the way. I think that's probably good, especially if you want some part of the character to be revealed before you do something specific in the plot. But I think it's something to be avoided, just like the passive tense, that you're going to do that too much. So it's really kind of there's an Aristotelian mean in there somewhere. If you do no characterization of any kind and it's all plot, people are like, I didn't take anything away from what these characters were doing. And if it's nothing but characters, people get bored because nothing's happening. So you gotta find that good happy medium there. And so there's 3 things that you can really avoid when it comes to writing bad dialogue. The last one is a tip for how to write better dialogue. So I'll finish with a positive one, which is read it out loud. Pick it up. If you're writing a book, just read through the dialogue. I usually do this with every single book and hear how it sounds. And then from there, you can figure out what words you usually emphasize. You can maybe put those in italics if it's important to emphasize a particular word. If you're doing a screenplay, this is really, really important because the sound of the words is what people are going to hear, not how they look on the page. Likewise, with a comic book, you're going to want to do the same thing. You're going to want to read them out loud to see if they're natural and they feel right and they're idiomatic for the character. And if you can do an accent, and if you're writing a character that's from England and you're not, it's a little bit more difficult. If you have to maybe imagine the accent or practice the accent to kind of feel how it's going to sound rhythmically. And then you can make little adjustments from there and avoid kind of writing bad dialogue. There's some other tips, like if you're writing historical fiction, obviously you want to avoid some of the idioms of modern language. You can't avoid all of them, or readers won't maybe disconnected from the meaning of what you're doing, but you don't want them to be using any sort of cliche phrases from the modern time. And cliches usually are pretty easy to avoid. The cat's out of the bag now. You wouldn't say that in feudal Japan, unless that happened to be a Japanese saying, which I don't think it is. So those are pretty easy to avoid, but try saying it out loud, and then you'll find if something feels a little awkward or off, you'll know that, and then maybe you can just try a couple different variations of what's there, and one of those is probably going to feel a little bit better. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. As per popular request, I do have a Patreon now. It's patreon.com/David V. Stewart. Right now, there's just 2 levels of patrons. If you want to give me $1 a month, there's going to be every 6 weeks or 2 months, there's going to be a book that's up there that's free for patrons that normally you'd have to pay to get. This month and next month, it's going to be Muramasa Blood Drinker, my samurai fiction novel. I don't think I have a copy. Here's a copy. Looks like this. So you'll get this one for free the next 2 months. If you want to be my thought criminal patrons, you're a prole. If you're $1, you're a prole. If you're $5 a month, then you're my thought criminals, and you'll actually get all my ebooks. So I have like a little ebook library. You can get all of them. If you just wanted to do 1 month and try reading all the books, you could do that for $5. It doesn't matter to me, but that's going to be kind of in perpetuity. And I wanted to do that just to give some extra value to patrons. If you get on there, you'll have access to, like, if I do some short fiction, which I'll probably do in the coming weeks, and get to tell me what kind of videos you want to see. I have a couple of goals up there for what kind of videos. So if you attach yourself to one project or one direction, whatever's getting the most attention there, that's what I'm gonna try putting my focus into. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.